16.2. Obviously, World War I, also known as the Great War. The reason for this, at the time, it was referred to as the war to end all wars. There had never been anything as big, as bloody, as deadly as this Great War. The big idea here is that the devastation of the war and the stalemate at the Western Front led to a widening of World War I. More and more countries became involved, and governments expanded their power to accommodate for the war. These governments began to shift what people were allowed to do, what they were allowed to say, how much food they ate, and where they worked in order to continue to supply for the war effort. The first thing we're going to talk about is between 1914 and 1915, kind of an illusion and also a stalemate. Many political leaders had thought that the war involved so many political and economic risks it would not be worth fighting. Others believed that diplomats could easily control any situation and prevent war. Government propaganda was spread, like the pictures you see below. Ideas that were spread to influence public opinion and stir national hatred towards others. If you see all the way down in the right-hand corner there, the German guy kind of beating up on a Brit, a Frenchman, and a Russian all at the same time while smoking a pipe. It looks like it's pretty easy. All the way to the left there, you see a "Who's absent? Is it you?" poster. It almost is reminiscent of an Uncle Sam wearing the British flag. And in the middle there, a young son and daughter sitting around their father, asking, "What did you do during the Great War, Daddy?" And how would you as a man want to answer that question when you look back after the war? Most people believed that their nation, whatever nation they were part of, their cause was just, and that they should go and fight. The governments promoted a short and successful war, basically saying, "Oh, you'll be home by Christmas time. It'll be great. It'll be something. It'll be a story that you can tell your family and friends that you took part in the Great War." On the Western Front, during the war, as Germany marched more towards Paris, they were halted by French troops at the First Battle of the Marne. Both sides during this battle dug trenches, making advancements from either side difficult. They both dug in and just stayed there. This resulted in a stalemate. For 4 years, both sides remained virtually in the same positions due to trench warfare. Again, we talked about that idea of the no man's land. It was bloody. It was bad. There were areas in which people had to eat, sleep, live, and fight all within a few short feet of each other. On the Western Front, we did talk to you guys already about the Schlieffen Plan, where Germany was going to infiltrate Paris. At the same time, they were going to be pushing the Russians out of Germany. At the First Battle of the Marne, the Germans were held up. The Frenchmen finally dug in and said enough was enough, and they did begin to stop, although it was difficult. Along with that, the German advance was halted. To stop the Germans, the French military leaders loaded 2,000 Parisian soldiers in taxicabs and sent them to the front lines. The war quickly turned into a stalemate outside of Paris between September 6th and September 10th. We also saw this idea of the trench warfare, and if you guys click on this from the other page, it'll take you to a trench warfare game. Again, this is a battle of inches, a war of attrition. It was physical. It was very deadly, and many people lost their lives. As I mentioned, what I mean by a war of attrition, it was fighting with no real headway, with nothing new coming from it. It was a continued battle. People kept banging their head up against the wall, and the same result continued to happen. Nothing changed. On the Eastern Front, the Russians were defeated in both the Battle of Tannenberg and the Battle of Masurian Lake in eastern Germany. Austria-Hungary was defeated by the Russians, though, and pushed out of Serbia. Germany, obviously believing that they are the strongest military around, comes to Austria's aid and pushes the Russians back into their own territory. What we're going to really talk about here are the German success. Initially in battle, they are very successful. They have the most advanced military, they have the most advanced weaponry, and for the first few months of the war, the Germans are pretty darn successful. They end up securing the Eastern Front, the area in and around France. At the same time, Russian casualties equaled about 2.5 million, almost knocking them out of the war entirely. The Russian people began to say, this is stupid, this is silly, why should we be involved in something? Our men are dying quicker than anyone else's. We also see that Bulgaria decides to join with who they perceive to be the winning team in Germany and Austria-Hungary. They turn around and they attack and eliminate Serbia from the war entirely. It was kind of like, hey, look what we can do. Let us be part of the party. And here's just kind of a map of the area between Russia and Germany, the orange dotted line, and then the colored dotted lines further to the right, where the Germans push back the Russians in Russia. We also see Italy decide to jump ship. If Bulgaria is going to join with Germany, Italy's going to get the heck out of Dodge. They decide to revolt and attack Austria-Hungary on May of 1915, and they, at that point in time, join with the Allied powers, stating that they had made a mistake, that they were merely only honoring the Triple Alliance. And once they realized how wrong, if you will, the Germans were, they completely jumped ship and decided to align themselves with the Allies. What we're going to see next are the new weapons in trench warfare that made the war by far the most devastating, more devastating than any previous war. Trenches were elaborate systems of defense protected by barbed wire. There were mines. Troops lived in these holes. They were separated by a strip of land known as no man's land. Basically, these dug-in trenches, if you were to get up and get out and get into no man's land, you were more likely than not going to be shot. We see that attacks consisted of heavy artillery fire, wearing down on the enemy's barbed wire. The soldiers would then attempt to advance to the enemy's trenches. So it would be, in football terms, it would be a running back trying to run the ball for 4 straight downs, trying to break through at some point in time, but knowing very well that they are going to meet resistance. The attacks were rarely successful because the advancing troops were often fired upon. As soon as you stood up out of your trench, you were going to get shot at, often by machine guns, ultimately killing millions of men. Again, why this is called the Great War. So many die. As the war begins to expand, because of the stalemate on the Western Front, both sides sought to gain new allies. Okay? These new alliances make up what was the Triple Alliance, now becomes the Central Powers of Europe. These Central Powers were consisted of the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. As you can see in the picture off to the right there, it's all about, hey, everyone's doing it, everyone's joining it, is propaganda, this picture here, making people kind of feel proud to be part of this new central power. And the war begins to spread. As the war begins to spread on other fronts, we see in the southern front, Italy attacking from the south now, changing sides and looking to make their mark, if you will, with the Allied forces. We also see a Middle East campaign, specifically looking at a guy named Lawrence of Arabia. He was a British officer. The Middle East had always been on the brink of this conflict, and he began to urge Arab princes to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, leading to a direct conflict between the Ottoman Empire as being part of the Central Powers and Lawrence of Arabia urging the Arab princes to revolt and essentially revolt against the Central Powers. Eventually, Britain begins to mobilize their colonies for war. No longer are they just going to be the island nation fighting, but they are going to call upon their colonies, the sun never sets on the British Empire, to come and fight for them. And the Ottoman Empire was destroyed in the Middle East by British forces who led a coalition of Indian, Austrian, and New Zealand forces. These were the British colonies. We're also going to talk today just very, very briefly about the United States and their entry to war. The United States had always kind of wanted to remain isolated. At first, the U.S. tried to remain basically neutral. As World War I dragged on, though, however, it became more and more difficult. The immediate cause of the United States grew out of the naval war between Germany and Britain. Remember, Germany had submarines before anyone else. What did the Germans do with these submarines? They sunk the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship, and on May 17, 1915, these German U-boats, undersea boats, sunk the British ship Lusitania. About 1,100 civilians, including over 100 Americans, died. Germany, at that point in time, said, "We will continue unrestricted submarine warfare." The United States bounces back and says, "If Germany does not stop unrestricted submarine warfare, we will attack Germany." And for a point in time, the Germans do stop unrestricted submarine warfare to avoid a conflict with the United States. Another direct result of the United States entering the war was the Zimmermann Note, or Zimmermann Telegram, which is kind of depicted here. The Zimmermann Telegram basically being a note that was quote-unquote intercepted from Germany to Mexico, stating that basically if Mexico promised to attack the United States, Germany would back them. And so this Zimmermann note really roused the people of America, saying, look, the Germans are plotting against us. Not only that, the Germans did re-enter using unrestricted submarine warfare, and the war cry began again to remember the Lusitania. Now, the German people said, well, the Lusitania was secretly bringing United States weapons and assistance to Britain, and that was why they sunk it. The truth is that very well may have been the case, but the United States was not having it, and they said, okay, if you are going to continue with your unrestricted submarine warfare, we're in. What that leads to is total war. World War I becomes a total war with governments taking control of their economies and also rationing civilian goods. Civilians are people who are not fighting. The war affected the lives of all citizens in the nations involved. What I'm talking about here is complete mobilization of not only resources but people. Everyone had a job to do and everyone had to make sacrifices, whether you were part of the fight or not. All people and industries were affected. We see that governments begin to plan economies, strict government control of the entire economy of a nation so that goods, products, services, weapons, and people could be rationed. We see that economies are directly controlled by all forms of government agencies so that they can make sure their troops fighting this war so far away had the things that they need. Basic things like cloth and aluminum, even lard for cooking was used to line the casings for gun bullets. And so with that, they needed to find a way to make sure that somebody's not sitting at home baking pies all day using up all their lard. And so the government began to also draft millions of men at once for service in their army. And last but not least, like I mentioned previously, governments begin to ration food supplies and materials, not only for their own military men, but for the countries in general. The total war affects everyone. Like I said, it's a total war. One group of people that is affected not because they're serving in the war, but because they are, in the words of our president at the time, just as important as any men serving. We're talking about women. Women in the workplace. Jobs that they maybe had never done before. The absence of men serving in the war, meant new jobs for women. Jobs like chimney sweeps, truck drivers, farm laborers, factory workers. The role of women played during the war had a positive impact on women, and it had an even more positive impact on the women's movement for rights. After the Great War and the men came home, many of the women did lose their job, but they did not lose their sense of pride.